Full disclosure, I had the help of the United States Meat Export Federation and the National Pork Producers Council help me develop some of these slides because we work in such collaboration together. So, a brief outline. I wanted to lay the framework of why exports are so important to the pork industry, kind of give you some numbers of 2010 to show you the importance of how we value these export markets. I'll go into international MRLs, briefly discuss how they're determined, politics versus science, how the pork industry manages to take those MRLs and shape those so we can conform to those MRLs to keep that market. And I've got two very, very good examples. One, Japan, that happened in 2006, just after I came to the pork board, and in Russia, what happened a couple years ago with some products. What we're working on for the next steps, and then I put up a slide of sources of information that anybody can go to look at not only domestic but export market MRLs. So export numbers. And if you look up here, we have 2008 through 2009. I wanted to put 2008 up there because that year, 2008, was the year where our export numbers were the tops of all time. We hit record highs in all across categories. 2009, we had a situation called H1N1 that lowered our exports just a little bit. And then in 2010, we really ramped back up and almost hit the 2008 mark. If you look, by far, that Japan is our highest importer of pounds of pork, followed by Russia, China, Hong Kong, Mexico, which has really come back up in the last couple years. As you can see, the U.S., we do import quite a bit of pork. We have the Asian up there, Canada, Australia, and Ukraine. If you put the U.S. based on market share, we are about a 30% market share in 2009, followed closely by the EU and Canada. And then if we project that out to 2019, our market share is supposed to grow to 40%. And so that means we're going to take market share away from Canada and the EU. And if you see, Brazil has remained fairly constant in the projections used in this model. If you look at pork production trends, here's how we stack up against Brazil, Russia, Canada, and Mexico. It is projected that we're going to produce more pork when you look at 2009, 2010, all the way out to 2018, 2019. And if you put that up to China, the EU, Brazil, who we're looking at kind of what our competition is doing, this is projected out that China is probably going to be our biggest competitor as we move forward in export markets, followed closely by the EU and then Brazil, but Brazil's still below us. Now, if you look at the annual pork export status for 2008, 2009, and 2010, this kind of shows back to that market share. We're still quite far ahead of the EU, who exports second only to us, Canada, Brazil, and China. But as you can see, a lot of these graphs I'm going to put up for our export markets is 2008 is that phenomenal year, 2009 is when our H1N1 hit, and then we're rebounding back in 2010. If you look at U.S. pork exports as a percentage of production, again, I like to always point out 2008. That was our phenomenal year for us. Last year, 2 years ago in 2009, was a dip down, but in 2010, we're about 24% of overall production is going export. And the projections for 2011 is to surpass 2008, and we're looking at a quarter of our production, 25% at least. And the numbers I'm hearing now is we're probably going to get above 25% of our production going export the way things are going right now. If you put it on a graph that looks at pork variety meat, PVM, pork variety meats, and then pork products, whole muscle products, if you look at 2008, it's a little over 2 million metric tons. In 2010, we're almost up to that category again. And then we're going to surpass that in probably 2011 as the volume hits in 2011. And if you project it out to 2013, we're just rising as we keep going. And if you look at what markets will probably grow in the next couple years, 2009, 2010, a prediction of 2011, And then MEF wanted me to put in there the potential for Korea and the new trade agreement, the new free trade agreement that could impact our market, is that one of the potentials is Korea. But if you look at our other potentials for Mexico, Japan, and China, Hong Kong, and Canada, the bottom line of this story is that our export markets are looking strong. The world population is growing, and it needs to be fed, and hopefully the U.S. can capitalize on that. This next graph looks at monthly U.S. pork and variety meat exports as a prediction of value. And if you look in last year in 2010 was our highest value year ever. Even more so than that 2008 version that we put more metric tons out there than the other year. But the value in 2010 by and far surpassed 2008. And if you can look up, I don't have a pointer, but if you can look up in 2009 what H1N1 did to our export markets and the value of how much that went down, and how we tried to rebound after the H1N1 that occurred in April-May timeframe. And if you look at the U.S. pork exports unit by values, again, it shows the same story, that 2010 so far has been our best year on record to date, followed closely by 2008 and then 2009. And here, this pie graph just puts down where our export markets, our top value export markets are. Again, it's Japan, followed closely by Mexico, then Canada, and then China. And when I get into, and this is 2010, and when I get into our Russia example, Russia used to be a much bigger player than what they are in this graph. And due to some MRL restrictions, we have not sent very much product to Russia and probably won't in the near future. And here's my last slide when it comes to, and I put this in there to look at the U.S. per capita meat consumption. And I've got poultry, beef, and pork up there. I just want to put this up there to show you that where we're going to grow is our export markets. Now, checkoff is, as you may have heard, we've got a new tagline out there, pork be inspired. So we're doing all I can to increase domestic pork consumption. But if you look at the previous graphs and charts compared to this little chart, is that most of our growth is going to come via export markets, and we got to satisfy those requirements. And those requirements are starting to mount as we talk. So international MRLs, maximum residue levels. This is quite a discussion when you talk to our producers or pay checkoff. When there's differences in MRLs, when you look at U.S. FDA established MRLs, international established MRLs when you're talking about codex. And then sometimes, not often, but sometimes certain markets will have their own export MRLs that are not the same as codex and not the same as FDA. And a lot of that difference is the risk assessment that they use, methodologies for identification, what is the target tissue, because sometimes U.S. won't have a residue established for muscle, and an export market will, so we have to extrapolate for a kidney residue, for a muscle residue. So you got to determine what is the target tissue. There's such a great difference in philosophies of approaches. There's no one standard approach, and as it was pointed out earlier, we run into non-tariff trade barriers, and this is one very good example of how a non-tariff trade barrier can impact our export market, is when you're talking about residues. And then the last bullet point is, who's really influencing these decisions internationally? Science versus politics, what's going on in that country, if they're part of the WTO, so we can push them toward codex. But all that goes into how do we combat and go back to that exporting country for establishing an MRL. So what is the U.S. doing, or the pork industry in the U.S. doing to address these issues? A lot of collaboration and communication. So NPPC and the Meat Export Federation are kind of our front runners to determine if there is a change in an MRL and then come back to us. But what really happens is when NPPC goes out there and MEF goes out there, they encourage the export market to take U.S.'s tolerances. That's the first step. Take the science-established U.S. FDA tolerance. If they don't do that, then we push toward a codex tolerance, an internationally recognized tolerance. Sometimes that doesn't work, so then they have to develop their own tolerance, and I'll get into an example with Japan, how they kind of developed their own tolerance, kind of went away from codex a little bit. But then once we get all that information, we go out and disseminate that information with packers, the American Association of Swine Veterinarians, the animal health companies, and then to producers. because what happens is a lot of these packers, they don't have earlier talked about these verification programs. They don't have a verification program for each export market, so you can't dictate this producer is going to go to Japan, that producer is going to go to the EU, that producer is going to go to China, this producer is going to go to Mexico. What really happens is they all come into the plant, they all go to cold storage, and as orders get filled, they just pull it out of cold storage and go to the exporting markets. So you can't have 6 different MRLs for 6 different markets and expect to satisfy those without some type of verification program or some standardized approach. So when we're looking at adhering to export standards, especially for MRLs, we look at the target tissue, and then we have to determine what testing methodology is occurring in there. Is it an HPLC? Russia was doing an HPLC with a double mass spec to get those tolerances down to the parts per billion. Are they using a charm screening test? We need to know the sensitivity and specificity of that test so we can come up with an accurate withdrawal time to satisfy those markets. Once the level has been found and the methodology has been determined, then we can go to the sponsor company or the pharmaceutical company and say, we've got the U.S. tolerance here, we've got our export market tolerance here. What type of withdrawal time do we need to satisfy that? 7 times out of 10, the difference isn't large enough that there needs to be an extended withdrawal time. But 9 times out of 10 is there needs to be an extended withdrawal time, that we have to communicate that through ASV, through the packers, through the pharmaceutical companies, through us, to the producers, to reach that MRL. And there's been a couple times that the MRL has been so low, and I'll get into that with Russia, is that we had to do some research to figure out what is the accurate withdrawal time to satisfy that MRL. Just because the difference between U.S. and the international standard is so different, so discrepancy that there's no data to extrapolate on. So my first example is what happened in Japan in 2006. They changed all their MRLs in 2006 and kind of got away from Codex. They came out with a list of I believe it was about 300 compounds that we had to sort through and compare that to the U.S. list and see which tolerances were the same, which were different, which were lower, and which ones we had to go back to the sponsor company to figure out if there is an extended withdrawal time. I put up 2 examples here. I didn't put their trade names down because I didn't want to call out any specific companies. But if you look, the first example is Tiamulin, where the U.S. has a tolerance for 0.6 parts per million. The withdrawal time was 7 days. Japan's new tolerance is 0.4 parts per million. And going back to the sponsor company of that particular product, they came back and said, we need to extend the withdrawal time to satisfy this. So we need to go out to 14 days rather than the 7. So we had to communicate that through that whole stream of packers, ASV, NPPC, pork board, to producers to say, if you use this product, you need to go out to 14 days. Not 7, but you need to go to 14 days for withdrawal time to satisfy that market. Here's another example where the kidney tolerance in the U.S. was 15 parts per million. The withdrawal time was 7 days. Japan, their only tolerances were in fat and muscle, and their tolerance were 0.1 parts per million. So that's a huge difference. Even though you're looking at 2 different areas of residues, kidneys versus muscle and fat, the sponsor company came back and said, well, according to our research, you need to extend the withdrawal time to 33 days. Which was a major step for producers, which takes another tool away from their cabinet to help fight any issues they may have. And we run into that quite a bit, where the U.S. tolerance is in a different tissue than the international tolerance, and we have to extrapolate that data. We're also getting into examples where some exporting countries are coming back to us and saying, we're going to put a tolerance on stomach tissue. We're going to put a tolerance on intestines. We're going to put a tolerance on hearts. And if you look, and working with these sponsor companies has been phenomenal, because you have to go back to them and tell them about these tissues. And what they come back and say is, well, when we applied for our withdrawal with FDA, we didn't have to look at those tissues. We didn't have to look at a tolerance down to 0.1 parts per million. So there's a difficulty in using what they use for FDA versus what these exporting markets are requesting from our producers and these pharmaceutical companies. And I will say that Japan has also reinstituted a risk assessment approach now. So they're going through all these antibiotics again and asking the sponsor companies, the Pfizers, the BIs, the Fort Dodges, to supply them with information. And if they don't supply them with information, they're going to take the 2006 tolerances and put them down to 0. So these pharmaceutical companies, these sponsor companies, are given all this information that they gave the FDA to Japan, so Japan can accurately depict what MRL they want on a lot of these tissues. So there's still Japan going on. And to date, we have not had a violation in Japan of their new tolerances from 2006. So veterinarians, producers, packers have been doing a great job at communicating this and following these added withdrawal times above and beyond what FDA has established. This last example is our Russia example in 2009, where they put a new tolerance on the tetracycline class antibiotics, Oxytet, Chlortet, and tetracycline, whereas the FDA tolerance is 2 parts per million in the muscle. And if you look at, depending on whether it's a feed grade, a water grade, or an injectable, the withdrawal time is anywhere from 0 to 28 days. Well, the Russians wanted to have a 0 tolerance in the muscle, but the best that they could do with their HPLC double mass spec was 10 parts per billion. And when I'm talking to these sponsor companies, they say the magic number is a 10-fold decrease. That's kind of when you need to look at if you're going to have an extended withdrawal time. So this is much greater than a 10-fold decrease. And if you look, that's such a difference in MRL tolerances that we had to actually go out and do some research to figure out what is the actual withdrawal time. Some historical perspective that we've always had a voluntary 14-day withdrawal period on tetracycline, on feed and water grade tetracycline molecules because of Japan. 10, 15 years ago, I believe it was, maybe even a little bit longer than that, maybe 20 years ago. But it seems that that voluntary 14-day withdrawal period was not satisfying this 10 parts per billion limit of detection for Russia. Then you throw in there the injection site versus oral, that the injection site is typically going to have a higher residue limit or higher residual than an oil application. So if Russia's going to test the muscle, are they going to happen to come across an injection site and see a hot piece of muscle there versus if it was given orally? And then, like I said, the research was only down to 2 parts per million. So we had to do additional research to figure out what withdrawal time would satisfy the 10 part per billion residue established for Russia. And I just found out last week that Russia may have added to their system, so now their level of detection is down to 2 parts per billion. So we're looking at another 5-fold decrease in what their limit of detection was. So now we're going to go from 2 parts per million for FDA in muscle down to 2 parts per billion in muscle for Russia. And if you've read in the meetingplace.com and some other places that we've been having plants delisted left and right for Russia on pork for the last couple years. Delisted, getting them relisted, and then delisted again for tetracycline and a class of antibiotics. So that's where we're at when we have to either do a sponsor company, go back to them and talk to them with withdrawals, or do our own research when it comes to the Russia example and how that we have to communicate that back to producers. So next steps, when the Russia issue came around, Chekhov developed what we called a withdrawal to satisfy the Japanese market. And we had all these compounds that had an extra withdrawal period on them on our website that producers and veterinarians and packers could see and then implement those withdrawal periods as they use those products. Well, now we're going away from a specific market approach. We're not going to say a Japanese market or a Russia market. But what we're doing is looking at all of our export markets and looking at all their tolerances and compare those to the U.S. tolerances and see which one is the lowest one that we have to abide by. So this way you can say, if you use this compound, you need this withdrawal time. Because as I said earlier, these packers don't have PV programs for each specific market, and they can't dictate where this producer's meat goes, that producer's, this producer's, and that producer's. The galls goes into mainly cold storage, and then as orders get filled, it goes out. So we're going to look at what is the lowest MRL out there and find out the withdrawal period that is needed to satisfy that so we don't jeopardize our export markets. And then once that's done, get that on our website. And again, communication to producers, veterinarians, use AASV, packers, newsletters, animal health companies, etc., so we don't lose those those export markets. And again, the best that we can do is the only swine-approved antibiotics compounds, because when they're off-label or extra-label use, there's going to be an added withdrawal time, and we can't depict how it's going to be used when it's off-label or extra-label. So we would encourage those veterinarians to contact FAIRAD, and we've been in communication with FAIRAD, is Food Animal Residue Avoidance Database, to establish a withdrawal time to meet those export market criteria. And then the last slide I put up here is these 3 websites that I use routinely when I'm looking at export markets and how we get impacted. The first one is FDA's website that has all products, all species, everything you want to know about tolerances and withdrawal times that you want for a domestic market. The second one is an industry-sponsored swine-only approved products up there, so that gets everything that FDA is approved for swine use is up on this website with the tolerances and the withdrawal periods. This third one is a new one that just came out last year. It's an FDA, FAS-sponsored, only FDA products on there. This contains multiple countries, and we're adding to that list. There's probably, I think there's about 20 exporting countries on there. We're going to get hopefully another 10 this year, along with Codex and FDA, so that you can look at all the product classes, and then you can compare U.S. to whatever country or international standard that you want on this website. And again, these are only FDA products. So there are certain situations where the exporting country has an MRL on a product that's not approved in the U.S., so you can't look at those products because this website only has FDA-approved products on that website.